The Long Way Home, Epilogue, Part 1 of 2. The high-pitched screams of little girls filled the air in the play structure. Tiny fists colliding with flesh were punctuated with shrill cries of fury. The shrill cries weren't from the little doggo girl in the sky-blue shorthorse and a pink blouse who knelt astride another little girl of an age with her. No, Lizette Freemas didn't shriek of fury. She let the human girl in name-brand clothes squeal, while she only let little grunts of effort escape her clenched teeth as she drove her little fists into the other girl. Lizette was starting to feel like the brat would get her point with just a few more examples when she felt strong, calloused fingers close around the scruff of her neck. "Crud," she whispered, as she was hefted into the air and plopped onto a spindly play surface, gently some 2 yards away. "Lizette, by Freemas," her father said sternly. "You turn around and look at me." The little girl gulped at that. Her full name. She was sure that she was going to catch trouble now. Still, though, trying to run away or sass her father would only make things worse for her. Reluctantly, slowly, she pasted a look of wide-eyed innocence on her face. It merely served to make her look more guilty under Vincent's hard gaze. "Oh, hi, Papa," she ventured weakly. "When did you get here?" Vincent's gaze didn't soften at all, and his voice had that deep growling quality that made Lizette stand up to the full height of her 5 years. "Another fight." Oh, yes, she was going to catch trouble for sure. Still, though, it wasn't in her nature to give up. "It wasn't my fault, Papa," she blurted out, and Vincent raised an eyebrow at her. That was all, and she wilted. "Well, it wasn't," she muttered. The other girl picked herself up and had a haughty sneer painted across her dark face under her raven black hair in many braids. And, like girls that age, she couldn't help herself. "Ha ha," she jeered. "You're going to get in trouble." Lizette shot her a baleful glare. "You stay put," Vincent said to his daughter, and she knew well that doing just exactly that would be a very good idea. She watched as the jerk of a girl's smug demeanor slid off her like soap in a shower as Vincent stepped up to her and looked at her. Lizette was used to her father's looks, but this passenger hadn't even met him before and didn't have any resistance built up. She looked guilty as sin, whereas Lizette thought she still looked innocent, contrary reality notwithstanding. "Give me your keycard, please, little miss." "You're not the boss of me," the passenger girl insisted, but her hand was already on her way to her jacket pocket. "I am crew, and you were just in a fight. You can give me your keycard so I can let your parents know to come get you, or you can come with me to the security office and wait for them there." Lizette carefully concealed her smug pleasure at the other girls catching trouble too. She failed, obviously, since she was only 5. Meanwhile, the girl grumbled under her breath as she handed it over. Vincent got out his compad, scanned the card's QR code, and then tapped out a message to the girl's parents. Vincent raised his eyebrow at her, and she snapped her mouth shut with a click of teeth as Vincent tapped out a second message. "I'm allowed to say that," the girl lied, and Lizette wondered how bad a cuss she'd said. She was too far away to have heard. "Then you won't be in trouble for it," Vincent said as he cast his glance between the two girls. "Come here, please," he said to the other girl, and walked back to Lizette. It wasn't a request, and the other girl must have known that, because she followed Vincent to stand beside Lizette. Lizette turned her nose up at her when she got close, and refused to look at her, so she'd know just what she thought of her, being such a stuck-up brat who was wrong about everything. "All right, explain." "She hit me first," Lizette boldly declared. Well, she tried to boldly declare. It came out as more of a whine, but the sentiment was there, probably. "Only because she said that I was dumber than a grub-infected toad," the other girl insisted. "Well, she said that cadet isn't the best pilot in the Navy." "How couldn't a cadet be the best pilot? Cadets are still learning how to pilot, fathead. Besides, everybody knows that the blue blur is the best, stupid." Lizette didn't know it, but Vincent expended a mighty effort to not laugh or sigh from pure exasperation. However, Vincent very patiently said, "The blue blur is her big brother. We call him Cadet because that's his nickname on the ship." "Oh," the girl said lamely, "but—" Vincent didn't let her start making excuses. "Lizette, what did I tell you about calling names?" Now that was super unfair. Here Lizette was trying to show how right she was, and her dad just had to go and remember that. "That is a good way to make a fool of myself," she admitted quietly. "Lizette, by Reavers, you will apologize to this girl for calling her nasty names." "And hitting me." Lizette turned to the girl and drew her up to say firmly, "I'm sorry for calling you dumber than a grub-infected toad. I'm not going to apologize for hitting you. If you're going to haul off and hit somebody, you don't get to cry because she's better at hitting than you." She gave her father a glimpse and caught the barest of approving nods as she spoke. That almost made up for the trouble she was in. Who says that you're better at hitting? The other girl said challengingly. However, before the question could be put to the test, Vincent broke in by saying, "Starting another fight is a good way to get a trip to the security office." "I'm not going to say sorry to her," the passenger declared, scowling and stamping her foot petulantly. Lizette rolled her eyes so obviously that there was just no way the other girl could miss it. "That's fine. I don't expect you to." "What's that supposed to mean?" the girl asked as she balled up her fists. "Remember what I said about the security office?" Vincent asked mildly. Too mildly. The last time Lizette had that tone directed at her, she was scrubbing bulkheads every day for a week straight. Both girls stared at their feet, neither one of them wanting to dig themselves deeper into trouble. They stayed that way until a ritzy-looking couple came along to collect their daughter. Lizette thought about saying something to really rub in how dumb the other girl was, but a furtive glance at her father's dour expression convinced her that would be a poor choice. Therefore, she contented herself with a small bit of satisfaction at the growing shiner she'd hung on the other girl's face, and the lecture on the ladylike behavior she was already receiving as her parents led her by both hands away. "Now," Vincent said, turning his full attention to her again. "Don't think I don't know you picked that fight." "She's the one who hit me," Lizette muttered as she kicked the springy surface on the toe of her shoe. "Save it for your mother," Lizette winced. Her father's punishments were often harsh, but they were physical. Chores, push-ups, running laps around the gymnasium, that sort of thing. Rose Primus, on the other hand, often made her sit doing nothing, or made her write lines. Far, far worse. "No, do we have to?" Lizette whined, as she allowed her father to envelop her hand in his and tug her along. "Yes, this is the third fight you've picked in a month, and this time it was with a passenger. They paid their fare and didn't buy their kids being poked and prodded until they're mad enough to indulge you in a fight. It's nearly violating the guest right." Wonderful. Great. Just perfect. Lizette would be writing lines for sure. "I just wish everybody could come home already." "Let's make sure there's a home for them to come home to." In a very different ship sailing the void of real space of a strategically important system, Boisman ship's cook Tima Kozov was in the presence of a culinary legend. Well, maybe Chief Petty Officer Gallery Master Vi, stormborn daughter of Sam, daughter of Eve, wasn't exactly a legend. Navy cooks don't tend to get much notoriety, but Boisman Kozov ran in the kinds of circles where a reputation for making rations edible was high praise. Rumor had it that she even had a recipe that made crayons taste something approaching acceptable. Not that anybody with the sense to stay on the ship had to worry about having to eat emergency rations, unlike those sorry dirt pounders. All of that aside, Boisman Kozov was on his first deployment aboard the John Darling, and he was working under one of the best cooks in the Navy. It shouldn't be surprising. He'd encountered more popular legends in the corridors. That shouldn't have shocked him either, since the John Darling was part of the SSRRG, and accepted only the best of the best. That left him wondering how he got in. They were running prep work, and he was on onion duty, and his knife, fashion motions were so well practiced that he hardly noticed what his hands were doing. That, unfortunately, left him time to think that the John Darling was under action. She shuddered ever so slightly beneath his feet, probably a result of a helmsman putting her through a tight maneuver. He was in back armor, and the Atma had all been pumped into storage. But his slanted eyes watered at the mere thought of the scent of freshly cut onions that should be filling the air. He tried not to think about that as he flicked his knife to roll another onion to the middle of the cutting board and scored it to peel away its dry husk. There was a sudden vibration felt through his boots, down to his very marrow, and Boisman Kozov had a sinking feeling he knew what that was. "What's that?" he asked over the local comms anyway. "Boarding torpedoes," a more veteran line cook said, this one cutting and seasoning chicken breasts. "Boarding torpedoes getting fried by our battle screens. Don't they know? Don't they know that they can't get through?" "They can get through," Chief Vi said quietly, "if they throw enough boarding torpedoes at us. Even then, most of the boarders won't survive the impact. Doesn't change that our crew needs to eat, and make sure there's something to eat is our job." Boisman Kozov swallowed his nerves and returned to his onions. The sounds of a bustling galley should have filled the air, and some more pleasant scents than freshly cut onion would have competed for his attention, and they had a job to do. However, he couldn't not feel the deck plating vibrate beneath his boots. He couldn't ignore how it put a coppery tang in the back of his mouth. Even so, he had a job to do, so he focused. The rest of the galley wasn't nearly so nervous as he, or at least that was what Boisman Kozov thought. Instead, there was a mood of quiet focus, the tension of readiness, and Chief Vi oversaw it all with some corrections or instructions here and there. Then the John Darling shuddered from stem to stern, and a stone dropped into the pit of Voidsman Kozlov's stomach. The captain's voice came over the helmet speakers. It came into his ears, calm, collected, and full of certainty. All hands! All hands! Confirmed boarding torpedo hits! Confirmed boarders! All hands! Bite the ship! Say again! All hands! Bite the ship! Lights down! Heat off! Chief By snapped out, though that second part of the order was more tradition than necessity. Collect arms and take up defensive positions. Try not to spill any blood on the food. A smattering of chuckling answered her final order. Training took over Voidsman Kozlov's shaking hands as he laid his knife down on the cutting board and took quick, sharp steps towards a small cabinet and joined the queue of Voidsmen drawing out carbines, furnished for armored fingers. His hands were shaking as they closed over the resin, and he was dimly aware of the fact that his HUD was online. He thumbed the select switch to burst fire and took cover against the bulkhead hatch leading to the corridor. Just like he'd drilled. He gulped, and Chief Spy's voice suddenly filled his ears. Stop holding your breath, kid. He realized that he was, and he let it out, and then made sure to keep breathing in deep, measured breaths. That's better. Stay in cover. Let them come to us if they get past the quarters. And we'll be finished by the time they call the all clear. A quick glance at the upper right of his HUD showed that Chief Spy had opened a private channel to reassure him, and he felt greener than fresh spinach. Aye, ma'am, he said simply. Just following my training and keeping my head. That's all I got to do. Good man. Voidsman Kozlov had heard some dirt pounders complain that their job was mostly hurry up and wait, and that the enemy was never very considerate of their time. He was starting to understand that complaint as his thighs started to burn from holding his squatting cover position, and he wanted nothing so much as to return to his knife and board. However, with the veteran Voidsman all about him all standing fast, he wasn't going to be the one to crack and show just how unsalted he really was. When the enemy did at last arrive, it was only 7 exarch grub victims in soft vac suits, and they had very clearly avoided running into other crewmen by sheer luck, since they were all clean. There was no sound. They locked on to the group guarding the galley and charged. Plasma casters spewed blue bolts of heat and energy with wild, unaimed fury. Voidsman Kozlov's mind noted that the controller must be distant or destroyed for them to be so uncoordinated. He put one of them in his sights and pulled the trigger. The backsuit exploded with a rush of air where one of the 3 rounds had hit his foe in the thigh, and blood splattered the deck. The grub victim stumbled to the deck and writhed there, as if being suffocated. Korshov just realized that he'd taken a life. He told himself once somebody's infected, they're as good as dead, but he was having a hard time believing that. He felt a jostle against his left knee, and a glance backward told him that Chief Spy had slapped him with her powerful rudder tail, even while she shot one of the grub victims through the faceplate. Breathe, she told him over the private channel. Voidsman Kozlov realized that he was holding his breath. In short order, he was back at his knife and board, chopping onions. He'd seen how the galley master got right back to work the moment the all clear sounded. He didn't want to display any less dedication. Besides, she'd gotten him through it. She'd kept him from freezing and making a fool of himself. He owed her for it. Meanwhile, in another ship, mere light hours away, a young man sat upon one of the 2 command thrones of a vessel of the Emperor Unchained's navy. Captain Lady Isis Magdalene was rigid in her seat. Her eyes were fixed on the readouts that informed her of the state of the engagement, and Captain Lord Mary John strove to match her. The ship shook, and she ran her hand over the armrest as if she could soothe the ship like an animal. It was not going well. Mary John knew that better than most. The grub controller's original plan of crushing the Reformation in one fell swoop had been disrupted by the Republic, and that had brought precious years for the Reformation to muster a military. But it was not without cost. 6 colony worlds had fallen, and the 7th was on the brink. Even the might of the Republic of Terra was hard-pressed, for the enemies had learned well that they could not take each of the nations in their own turn, and fought a united front. The Star Council, the Greater Interstellar Alliance, the Hive, the Kingdom of Jacovia, and the Draconian Empire had all lost colony worlds to the invasion as a result. Of course, none of the Terran nations had lost a world yet, but that was simply an accident of galactic geography. The Terrans had lost plenty in blood to slow the advance, however. Mainly, they bought time with the enemy's blood, but they had paid a price in their own in the past 10 years of war. None of that was at the fore of his mind, however, for on this day he did battle before the woman that made his heart flutter. "Captain Lady, Captain Lord," her census officer called, "I do read a disturbance which indicates translation from hyperspace C." A glance at the relevant reader showed him that he was right, and that the incoming ship would outmass his cruiser by 12%. Well, within the differential for naval strength, but that only it was alone. The other 3 smaller ships would pose greater problem, for they shall screen the incoming vessel from their munitions, or turn to flank and force Captain Lord Mary John to distribute the battle screens and prevent focus fire. Such was the time for daring. "All ahead, set us on spin, prepare for drop mines," he commanded, and Captain Lady Isis Magdalene's eyes went wide at his order. "Sensors, I desire the precise entry points plotted. Helm, our course must pass through at least 3 of them," Captain Lady Isis Magdalene snapped out. Her eyes glittered fiercely, and Captain Lord Mary John found himself grinning. "Behold the rear guard, let none assail our friends while we yet fight." "I obey, O Captain Lady, O Captain Lord," the relevant officers called, and Captain Lord focused on being as resolute as the stones of a mountain, or at least looking so. Beneath his skin, his heart thundered with the terror and thrill of mortal combat, and his officers clenched their teeth and gripped their controls with it. But he was a little Captain Lord, and when an officer shot a furtive glance his way, he had a appear confident, cool, resolved. He hoped that he did half so well as Captain Lady Isis Magdalene. The pitch of the ship's engine shifted as they altered course and began spinning. Captain Lord Mary John's heart pounded against his ribs like a hammer on an anvil. The communications officer offered a prayer in a manner of Christ's followers. "Deploy mines at each translation point we intersect," Captain Lord Mary John ordered. How could his voice sound so steady when terror gripped his very throat? A question he had asked himself many times before. A question that would be asked again in times hence. "My father tells me that you've sued for my hand in marriage," Captain Lady Isis Magdalene murmured of a sudden. "Miles away," the ordnance officer called. Captain Lord Mary John hardly heard it. His hearing was full of echoes of the words father and marriage. "You've heard it so," he replies to my suit not. "He asked if I find you acceptable. What say you then?" "I say you took your time in making the suit. Should I now make you wait as you made me?" she answered, and Captain Lord Mary John's heart skipped several beats as he saw one of her rare impish smiles. "As the Terrans say, turn and turn about is fair play." "I shall wait upon you as long as you shall require," he whispered huskily, as the helmsman reported that they had reached minimum safe distance from the mines. He coughed and ordered, "Come about broadside. Keep up the spin. Once the mines detonate, mop up." "I'll have replied already to my father. We shall accept your suit, and we shall wed as soon as our families can gather." "There is less of my family than there was." There was less of many people's family than there had been, of course, and the grief that touched his voice had lost its bitterness. Captain Lady Isis Magdalene nodded gravely as the censor officer reported that all 4 incoming vessels had been disabled, while the gunnery crews pounded their remains into so much scrap as the ship kept up her spin. "Then I must make allowances for circumstances. We shall wed as soon as possible, and those kept from our ceremony by duty must understand the constraints of war," Captain Lady Isis Magdalene said, and Captain Lord Mary John wondered why she had chosen that moment to tell him the news. Then he looked around the bridge and saw that the officers had relaxed, that their determined expressions were a shade less grim. Then he realized it was for them, to give the men thoughts for the future, thoughts of light in the darkness. Then he smiled knowingly at his betrothed. Elsewhere in system, Ensign Alexander Kohopia was at the stick at the Hellcat fighter interceptor. It looked nothing like an aircraft of its namesake, but Ensign Kohopia thought she was pretty craft. Thoughts about the Hellcat's appearance weren't all that relevant to what was going on at the time. It was strange how sometimes such thoughts would flirt at the edges of his awareness, as he laid his ears back and bared his fangs to bank hard to starboard, pitch up, and yaw down. He still wasn't used to not feeling G-forces from rapid changes in momentum. He'd learned as an in-atmo pilot first. But enemy hot plasma streaked through what would have been his place in the attack formation half a second after he'd gotten clear. He flexed his hands, and his claws extended and retracted before he hit a button to deploy chaff drones. "They're on your tail, Bluefall," his CO, Lieutenant Cadet Freemus, said. Of course, his real name wasn't really Cadet, but his real name was too long to say. Everybody in the squadron called him Cadet. Most people outside the squadron called him the Blue Blur. And until 3 weeks ago, Ensign Kohopia was in the latter category. A glance at the radar showed that they weren't just on his tail, but there was a trio of enemy interceptors on each of their tails. This was hardly his first dance, though. One didn't wind up a pilot attached to one of the destroyers in the SSRRG without being one of the best pilots in the Republic. One didn't show their quality without seeing combat, even if that was only during OCS. "Aye, sir," he growled into his comm as he performed a tight roll turn to meet his pursuer's nose on. That gave him an excellent view of the rest of his wing scattering to turn the hunters into hunted. In point of fact, without his HUD, he'd have been hard-pressed to make any sense of which points of light in this inky black space were doing what. But his Hellcat kept track of the other 3 craft in his wing and highlighted the enemies for him. That was enough to see that being one of the best fighter pilots in the Republic still left him with a great deal to learn. While he was still lining up his shot, Ensign Cortez slipped behind all 3 of his pursuers and lit up one of the lasers while sending missiles at the other 2. Lieutenant Junior Grade Oxhorn cut across the dismantled CO's pursuer with his main cannon, while Lieutenant Primus put a missile at each of Oxhorn's. Even while thoroughly awed, Ensign Kohapia kept his head well enough to send ferrous material ripping through the craft, screaming at him nose on, and to juke to port just enough to miss the debris at the last second. However, as he sent his Hellcat into a tight starboard roll to avoid another expanding debris cloud, his ears were filled with the sound of a lock-on alarm. "Fuck!" he breathed as he pitched down. A bare second after, a missile detonated against one of his chaff drones. The shrapnel sent flares of light rippling across his Hellcat's battle screens. But he was already corkscrewing to starboard in an effort to shake his pursuer. But the enemy pilot stuck on him like a burr in a fur. "Hang in there, kid," Lieutenant Primus called over the comms. "I'm on my way." "I can shake him, sir," Ensign Kohapia replied through clenched teeth as he tried to do just that. He had limited success, and so adjusted his goal to buying time for one of his wingmen to make it in time to prevent him from becoming so much debris. Missile after missile detonated against his chaff drones, and he was seriously considering deploying another batch as shrapnel made his Hellcat's battle screen shimmer, and his reactor's heat gauge climbed. He snarled wordlessly as he gunned the throttle to gain a little distance, planning on repeating his opening roll turn. However, his HUD told him that Lieutenant Primus's Hellcat was screaming at him, nose on, danger close, and he had a brief moment or two to appreciate its sleek, aggressive lines and glimmering blue paint before it shot past him in a blur. The enemy's pip blinked out on his radar's display, and he was confused. "Sir," he asked, "how'd you do that? I thought you were too close for cannon, laser, or missile." "Aye, but I could give him a bump with the edge of my battle screens and put him in Bluetooth's line of fire," the lieutenant explained briskly, and just as if the maneuver wasn't insanely dangerous. "Don't try that. You're not good enough yet," he added belatedly. Ensign Kohapia swallowed and said shakily, "Aye, sir." "Back on mission, gents. Let's not let any gnats annoy the John Darling," Lieutenant Primus ordered. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.